facts, not fear. Who are American Muslims? So this is the section that I will be going through, our first module. I'm going to cover why the media matters. I then will look at replacing fear with facts, all very evidence-based survey of who American Muslims are and what they believe. And then we'll end with a brief discussion of tips and examples for creatively and confidently covering American Muslims. So why does the media matter? Well, these are a few discussion or a few pieces of data on the media. The majority of Americans do not know a real Muslim, and that's from surveys. And what that means is that the majority of Americans will then rely on the media to inform them about the community. According to a study conducted by Media Tenor, 80% of coverage of Islam and Muslims in the US news media, and that's specifically TV news media, is negative. That compares, just for reference, to North Korea, and the coverage of North Korea is 73% negative. So it's really it's cause for concern. Another study conducted by 416 Labs showed that over the past 25 years, the New York Times portrayed Islam and Muslims more negatively than cancer and cocaine. Now, why does that matter? Is there a link between what people see in the media and some of the opinions that they might form? According to this study led by Muniba Salim, who also is an ISPU scholar and a professor at the University of Michigan, reliance on media for information about Muslims, which is what most people are doing because they don't know a real Muslim, was associated with American support for public policies targeting Muslims 3 months later. These policies included military action against Muslim countries, separate and more thorough airport security lines for Muslim travelers, and even revoking the right to vote for Muslim Americans. So reliance on negative media for information is linked with all of these, with consent for all of these policies. So the media absolutely matters. How do we replace fear with facts? Who are American Muslims? Well, American Muslims are the most diverse faith community in the United States. We have a part of our photo narratives in the back for your review, and you can read more about all of these amazing people on our website or on muslimsforamericanprogress.com. So in Michigan alone, Muslims make up 15% of all doctors, though they only are less than 3% of the total population. In Michigan alone, Muslims contributed 1,600 patents, donated more than $177 million in charitable donations, are the owners of 35,000 businesses that create more than 100,000 jobs. The most ethnically diverse and youngest faith community in the United States. So by far, Muslims are the youngest faith community. As you can see, 80% of Muslims are 49 years or younger. A full quarter are between the ages of 18 and 24. The average age of Muslims is 25 years younger than the national average. They're also the most ethnically diverse faith community in the United States. Muslims are the only faith community with no majority race. As you can see, a quarter of the Muslim community identify as Black, Another quarter identify as white, and then 18% each identify as either Asian or Arab. 7% say they're mixed, 5% identify as Hispanic, and then we have 1% who are Native American, and then other. This is important because of representation. Who are we, who's speaking for Muslims in the media? Does this actual representation, is that reflected in who we're interviewing, who we're tapping as sources? Are these the stories that we're covering? If a quarter of our community identify as Black, is the Black community represented in coverage of Muslim American life? So this is a really important just reference for when you're thinking about who to tap for interviews. Muslims are the most likely faith community to have been born outside the United States. So half of Muslims are born in America, native born, and half were born outside the United States. But 86% are citizens. So immigration is a part of the American Muslim story, but it's not the whole story. So there's, it's a balance. Oftentimes we hear stories and Muslims are only portrayed as immigrants, or immigration is the only part of the American Muslim story that we hear. And it's not that it doesn't exist. It's absolutely an important piece of this, but half of Muslims are also native born. And so to balance those two depictions of the American Muslim community. Muslims are the most likely to report low income. And I think that's really an important piece of this. We don't hear a lot about poor Muslims. And Muslims are also doctors and engineers and inventors and so forth. But the idea of socioeconomic disadvantage being associated with American Muslims is hardly ever spoken about. And it's a part of the story, and an important one to discuss as well. Now, despite the fact that such a high percentage are living at or just above the poverty line, Muslims are actually highly educated. And so that is a dimension of the immigrant story, right? You're educated, but you're struggling. So as likely as other faith communities to be highly educated, and that especially applies to Muslim women. In terms of politics, Muslims and Jews are the most likely to identify as Democrats. 6% of Muslims identify as Republicans, 44% as Democrats, and 41% as independent. So you'll notice Muslims are the most likely to identify as independent, actually. And part of that is that many Muslims would have, just from their around their values and around their worldview, would have identified as Republicans. But the Republican Party is very alienating to many Muslims. So they end up in the independent group. And that does mean that they are a group that is not partisan for the most part. They are voting based on policies rather than one party loyalty. What are Muslim American priorities politically? Jobs is the most important, the most frequently mentioned priority that American Muslims mention when it comes to what the government should be working on. And then the second is civil liberties, bigotry, discrimination. The third is healthcare, education, and poverty as sort of one group. And then national security and terrorism comes next. The interesting thing that I think is important to note here is what isn't in the top, 7 things mentioned. We went all the way to 1% at global warming. And that is social issues that are associated with the religious right. Muslims are not talking about LGBTQ rights or lack of rights. They are not actually mentioning things like abortion. They are not mentioning the things that you might associate with a deeply religious community. They look very different in terms of their political priorities from, say, white evangelicals. And I think that is an important piece of this because Muslim Americans' political priorities really look very similar to, kind of like a mainstream Democrat than say, a conservative, political religious faction. Those are important pieces to keep in mind in the discussion of Sharia, which we will be doing later. Muslims face similar social challenges as other American faith groups. So they are unique in many ways, but they are also similar to other American faith communities. So when it comes to race and race tension, as I said, American Muslims are the most racially diverse faith community. Now, what does that mean in terms of intra-Muslim race tension? Well, across faiths, Black Americans are equally likely to experience racism from their own faith community, and Muslims are no different. Now, what this shows is that Black Muslims and African Americans in the general public are equally likely to say that they have experienced discrimination by another member of their faith community. Muslims are less likely, though, to experience racism from another Muslim than from the general public, far more likely to experience discrimination based on race from the general public. And that, interestingly, is similar across race groups within the Muslim community, whether people identify as Black, white, Asian, or Arab. Before I get the question on white Muslims, people are always like, 24% of Muslims are white? That's crazy. Well, here's where that comes from. So a lot of immigrant Muslims identify as white, so Bosnian Muslims, Chechen Muslims, Albanian Muslims, Turkish Muslims, Iranian Muslims, all of these people identify as white. There's also white converts. So it's not all white converts. There are many, many Arab Muslims immigrant Muslims identify as white. And that also includes some Arabs. Even though we put Arab as a choice, some Arab Muslims will still, just identify as white. So the 24% is the right number. It's the same number Gallup got, Pew got. It's just what it is. We just have to sort of accept that number as real. We looked at domestic violence. So we wanted to really look at a lot of the social issues that are discussed in our country and are oftentimes uniquely attributed to Muslims. Here's what we found. Domestic violence plagues most faith communities equally. So the question we asked is, do you know anyone in your faith community that was a victim of violence from a family member? 13% of Muslims said they did know someone, and that's similar, no statistical difference between that and Catholics at 15%, Protestants at 17%, non-affiliated Americans as well, of course, as the general public, equal across the board. Muslims were also as likely to report having reported that incident to the police, and it's about 54%, basically across the board. So about half of people, no matter what their faith community, are reporting these things to the police. Where Muslims are different is that they are much more likely than other faith communities to go to a religious leader with that piece, with that incident. And that, I think, is quite interesting. So they are more likely to report it to a faith leader because it implies or it suggests that people look to their faith tradition as a place where this wouldn't be tolerated. Look to a faith leader as a possible ally. And it also suggests that faith leaders within the Muslim community have to be trained and educated on how to handle these kinds of things compassionately. In terms of, and I say this, it's especially interesting, the difference in how likely Muslims are to report to a faith leader when you consider the fact that Muslims and Catholics, and actually even Protestants, are very similar in their how often they frequent a religious service. So it's not as if Muslims are much more likely to be, practicing or attending a mosque. They're very similar to Catholics and Protestants, but yet still much more likely to involve a religious leader in the struggle of domestic violence. Now, young Muslims are unique. Unlike their peers, young Muslims are as likely as older Muslims to say religion is important to them. And that's the turquoise here. So 91% of Muslims between the age of 18 and 29 say religion is important, and it's basically no statistical difference as you get older, unlike the general public where it definitely, older people in the general public are much more likely to say religion is important than younger people. So that's where Muslims are unique. Now, where they are very similar to the general public, though, is that younger Muslims are less likely to attend a mosque as frequently as their elders. So there is some kind of an obstacle in engagement with a mosque, but it isn't that they're not valuing their faith. Now, Muslims disproportionately feel the negative effect of the political climate. And we see this in a number of ways. The first, and maybe the most heartbreaking, is in terms of children and bullying. This statistic has been quoted in a number of places, but nearly half of American Muslim families with children in schools say that their child has experienced bullying at some frequency during the last year. Far more likely to be targeted for bullying because of their faith than any other faith community in America. But what is perhaps even more alarming is that 1 in 4 of the times a teacher or an administrator is the bully or involved in the bullying themselves. And 3/4 of the time the incident has been reported. American Muslims are also the most likely faith community to experience religious discrimination. So the majority have experienced or report to our surveyors experienced some level of faith-based discrimination, far more likely than any other faith community. Muslims and Jews are also the most likely to say that they feel fear and anxiety post the 2016 elections. So as a result of the outcome of the 2016 presidential elections, have you done any of the following? And this one is feared for your personal safety or that of your family from white supremacist groups like neo-Nazis or the Ku Klux Klan. A full 38% actually report feeling personally unsafe. And we'll kind of close with some myth busters. Muslim women, as I mentioned, surpass Muslim men in education quite significantly. Muslims' frequent mosque attendance is linked to greater civic engagement. This is actually common, in America. People who attend a religious service, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or any other faith, that is actually linked with greater civic engagement, and Muslims are no different. This is important to keep in mind in light of some of the allegations that were swirling around during the campaign, where some candidates were implying or actually just openly saying that mosques were a source of radicalization. It's actually quite the opposite. Mosques are linked to greater democratic engagement, which is the exact opposite of what a group like, say, ISIS would want. American faith groups share both a strong religious as well as a American identity, and American Muslims are really very similar to all other faith communities. Their faith is important to them, and their American identity is also important to how they think of themselves. Now, how do these two identities relate to each other, though? Is one being stronger related to the other being weaker? And so we could actually find that out by looking at the two variables independently. And here's what we found. We actually found that Muslims with a strong American identity were more likely to have a strong religious identity, not less likely. So a strong religious identity and a strong American identity were linked. The stronger your American identity, the more likely you were to also have a strong religious identity. They were not trade-offs, and they were not in conflict. They were actually not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. Muslims are also the most likely faith group to reject violence, against civilians carried out by the military. And this is actually, we looked at targeting and killing civilians. Muslims were the most likely to reject this kind of violence carried out by military, and equally likely to reject it when it came to it being carried out by an individual or small group. Now, interestingly, when it comes to the need to condemn terrorism, the public as well as the Muslim community is split. So the question was, American Muslims, leaders and organizations should either condemn terrorism publicly to reassure the public, or, the question was, which comes closest to your point of view, even if neither is exactly right. Either American Muslim leaders and organizations should condemn terrorism publicly to reassure the American public that American Muslims don't sympathize with it, or American Muslim leaders and organizations should not have to condemn terrorism because the American public should assume that American Muslims reject it. And what was really surprising is that there's no consensus. People are actually split. Even in the American public, though they're more likely to say that Muslims should condemn it, it's not a majority. It's 44%, 34% say no, the American public should assume that Muslims reject it. And then a lot of people either say both or neither or don't know. And what I found really interesting is that 50% of Muslims believe that Muslims should condemn terrorism. More likely than the general public, in fact, to hold that view. So there is no consensus, and it's actually something that people are split on. Now, tips and examples for creatively and confidently covering American Muslim life. So to move beyond the security lens, oftentimes American Muslims are viewed through the security lens, cast as either good or bad from purely a security-oriented perspective. Stories about bad Muslims who are violent, or the rare good Muslim who is rooting out extremism in his own community, sometimes can dominate the American imagination about Muslim American identity and community. And so I think, the idea is to Americans that are Muslims are more than this binary. They are doctors and cab drivers, school teachers and physicists, expand the voices that inform your reporting. So what stories feature the voices of American Muslims or Americans that are Muslim in my media outlet outside of national security? Questions just to ask. Are we including Muslim voices in stories about what concerns all Americans? Things like education, or job creation, or healthcare, or domestic poverty. So to move beyond the security lens as one major tip. So I just have some examples of where great journalists have done that. So there was a wonderful NPR segment on bullying, Muslim school children bullied by fellow students and teachers. And we'll send you links to all of these for your reference. Another one on the role of Muslims in alleviating the Flint water crisis. Michigan Muslim community organizations joined forces to help Flint water crisis. So it says, as Muslims, so this was a quote by the Michigan Muslim Community Council leader, and I'll just read the second part. The Flint community needs us, and MMCC, in conjunction with our various partners, are helping to, by providing them with clean drinking water, filters, educational material related to the hazardous water, offering free lead testing, and raising money to assist the Flint communities. So the second kind of big issue is this idea of this dichotomy between us and Islam. This wonderful quote that we all, I think, remember: Islam doesn't hate us. And it's not because Islam loves us. It's because Islam is us. There is no dichotomy. There is no binary between us and Islam. There has never been an America without Islam. So to kind of break this false binary between us, who is us, and Islam. So it was really interesting because in response to Islam hates us, I was getting a lot of questions from journalists saying, well, can you tell me, can you prove or give me information about why Muslims actually love America? Meaning Muslims globally or something. And I'm like, no, Muslims don't love America. There's actually a lot of anti-American sentiment in majority Muslim countries, but that's not the problem with the statement. The statement said us, and it said Islam, and they were opposites. That's the problem. It's not that I can't find a single Muslim in the world that hates America. No, I'm sorry. A lot of people other than Muslims also hate America, and a lot of them are our European allies. That's not the problem. The problem is we are creating a false dichotomy that shouldn't be there. There's never been an America without Islam, and Muslims from, Islam and Muslims, from early explorers to enslaved Africans to immigrants from around the world. Despite this, Islam and Muslims are often cast as foreign, non-American, the other. Black Muslims also make up between 25 and 33% of all American Muslims, and we'll be hearing more about that later. The largest single race group. American Muslims are just that, American, and should be treated like any other American in how we discuss their stories. So am I unintentionally othering Muslims by casting Islam as a non-American religion, despite its long history in our country? Am I being representative and including Black Muslim voices in my reporting on, quote, Muslim stories? So some really great examples of when that's been done. AJ Plus did a video series called Being Black and Muslim. And the video about Black Muslim art projects included ISPU data on race. The Intercept did a great story. It was called A Progressive Muslim Candidate Wants to Flip a Florida District. He'll have to beat both parties to do it. Really cast this candidate as naturally and unapologetically both American and Muslim. And there was no dichotomy. It was just who he was. So featured an American Muslim candidate that utilized and also utilized an interview with an ISPU scholar. So what's religion got to do with it? That's the other big kind of theme is Islam is too often cast as the explanation for everything that Muslims do. For any negative, mostly negative things that Muslims do or any Muslim behavior, but rarely their positive behavior. So while other factors like mental health challenges, poverty, domestic violence are unexplored. So Americans that are Muslim are complex human beings, and their motivation is also very complex, right? Let's not assume that religion is the dominant driver in their behavior. So questions just to ask. Would I assume religion was the driving force in this story if the subject were Christian? Just a question to ask as you're reporting. What other factors might explain the behavior? Could trauma or economic factors be a powerful variable or a more powerful variable than culture and religion? Now, some good examples of where that's been done. Vox did a story, Bigotry Complicates Everything, where they actually discuss the rarely discussed issue of Muslim mental health. I mean, just introducing the concept into the public imagination, I thought was very useful. Another one that was, I think, a good example of that. Investigators said, so this was a story in, I believe, the Washington Post. Investigators said they killed for ISIS, but were they different from, quote, regular mass killers? So it was actually questioning the assumption that some of these folks were any different. You know, so the quote from it said, Omar Mateen has more in common with Dylan Roof than he does with Osama bin Laden, Langford said, referring to the white supremacist who is accused of fatally shooting 9 black churchgoers last year in Charleston, South Carolina. Muhammad Abdul Aziz, who killed 5 people in a shooting rampage at military recruitment centers in Chattanooga, Tennessee, suffered from severe depression, suicidal thoughts, and drug abuse. Just the fact that we're complicating some of these stories, questioning if religion was the primary driver, I thought was very important, very useful. To use culturally neutral language. So Arabic words or culturally specific language is often used to describe behaviors that are not unique to Muslims or Arabs, making the behavior seem pathological to these communities. So let's just be factual and avoid loaded or Orientalist language. Am I assigning foreign or Muslim-sounding words to a universal human behavior? So if something happens in a family, someone is hurt, it's usually called domestic violence. We don't have to insist on calling it an honor crime because it involves a Muslim. So these kinds of, really to be sensitive to these kinds of loaded cultural language that is unnecessary and actually inaccurate. Am I assigning foreign or Muslim-sounding words to universal human behavior? What would I call this type of behavior if it did not involve a Muslim? So instead of Islamic terror, try ideologically motivated violence carried out by a Muslim, a Christian, a white person, whatever it is. Instead of Islamic State, try self-proclaimed Islamic State or so-called Islamic State. Instead of jihadists, what about armed militant? More factual. Instead of an honor crime, how about domestic violence, which is in fact what the crime is. Examples of where that's been done. Well, this one, U.S. military kills 150 ISIS fighters with airstrikes showing war against militants is far from over. Article uses culturally neutral language to describe militants. Doesn't mean not covering the issue, just means using culturally neutral language. Another story, sheltering Muslim domestic violence survivors. Story about a really hard topic, but uses neutral, accurate language to do so. A story about domestic violence, shelter for Muslim women, uses culturally neutral language to describe gendered violence. Frames the problem as universal and not something that only impacts Muslim women. Could have added ISPU stats showing prevalence in each community. So that was a... And then my favorite topic, represent Muslim women accurately. So Muslim women are often depicted as victims of their religion or culture, or alternatively as victims turned escapees. This flies in the face of actual data showing that American Muslim women overwhelmingly see their faith as an asset in their lives and instead actually see racism and Islamophobia as their biggest challenges. So let's just be accurate and representative. Feature Muslim women's stories that are driven by the priorities and points of view of most Muslim women, just in terms of representation. Is my story about gender in the Muslim community falling into the trope of Muslim women as either victims or victims turned escapees? Have I included the voices of Muslim women in my reporting that represent the vast majority, meaning Islam positive, educated, and more challenged by racism and Islamophobia than Muslim misogyny? Am I framing misogyny in the Muslim community as unique or exceptional instead of universal to all communities? And I love this story about Amani, the founder of Muslim Girl, where it was talking about why she started Muslim Women's Day. And this was in CNN. Living in Jordan, this is her quote from the article, living in Jordan proved to be, this is from the article. Living in Jordan proved to be a transformative experience. Al-Khattabi grew to love her religion and began slowly reclaiming her identity. She chose to wear hijab as a mark of defiance against Islamophobia. She felt angered to see how the Middle East, and particularly Muslim women, were represented in the news. And according to our research, Amani's point of view is shared by the vast majority of Muslim women. So, in closing, I just want to draw your attention to resources, and you will have all of these also emailed to you. Resources at your fingertips. The American Muslim Poll, ISPU, that's wrong, ispu.org/poll. So we'll fix that. Muslims for American Progress, and that's about Muslim contributions in Michigan. We have a library of resources, research papers, briefs. We are coming out with new research all the time, and you can be the first to learn about it by joining our newsletter.